to the point because our speaker for today does not have too much of time at hand. So after this elaborate monologue by me, let me just very quickly introduce our stellar speaker for the day, Mr. Bruno Tertrais, who's the deputy director of the Foundation for Strategic Research, which is the leading think tank of France on international security issues. And he's also an advisor for geopolitics at the Institute Montaigne. I'm very sorry, my French is totally out of handle, so apologies for that. Bruno has an extremely long and distinguished resume, which we are not actually in a position because we are pressed for time to speak on, to discuss. But he has been affiliated with the RAND. He has written policy papers for the president, for the prime ministers. He has also been part of strategic dialogue processes of international caliber and standard, and several things and publications which have been read by virtually all of us who are part of the strategic community. Without further ado, I just keep my peace, and I would request our speaker, because he, as I mentioned, he's pressed for time. He's going to speak to us for 20 to 30 minutes, and after that, we are going to have 20 to 30 minutes of interaction with him. So please be very mindful of the time. And the topic that he's going to talk to you people about today is nuclear deterrence and proliferations, lessons from Ukraine. Over to you, Bruno.
Thank you very much, Salma, for this very kind introduction. Good afternoon to all. It's the hottest day of the year here in Paris, so I can't imagine what it is in Islamabad and in other places of Pakistan, a country that I know a little bit, and I'm delighted to speak to this audience, but we are really not used to it. But this is almost South Asian weather today, except for the humidity, of course. Anyway, enough with the small talk. I'll do a rather short presentation, something like 25-30 minutes, on the nuclear consequences of the Ukraine war. I hasten to say that I will only talk about military nuclear issues. I will not talk about civilian nuclear security, which is a huge topic, obviously, regarding Ukraine, but one on which I have less expertise, I'm afraid. So let me give you my main points first. I think that the risk of nuclear use in the Ukraine war, which is far from being over, unfortunately, is sometimes overestimated. I strongly believe that Moscow is actually acting rather responsibly regarding nuclear weapons, despite all the talk of, quote, saber rattling, unquote, in some Western media. Then again, that's the good news. Then again, I'm afraid that the relevance of nuclear weapons during the Ukraine war, which I will talk about, could also be, in some respect, a boost to nuclear proliferation, albeit in a limited way. So let me start first with what I call the shadow of nuclear weapons over the Ukraine war. I mean, the war is, in many ways, a conflict under a nuclear shadow or in a nuclear atmosphere. Although there is no clear evidence for that, it seems clear to me that it is the possession of nuclear weapons that allows Moscow to conduct major offensive operations in its neighborhood, what we call, and I think rightly so, a war of aggression. But there is more to that. Some of you may recall that on the 24th of February, when Mr. Putin announced the beginning of what he calls a special military operation, he mentioned the alleged existence of a nuclear weapons program in Ukraine, or at least a Ukrainian interest in nuclear weapons, which is nonsense, but it's sort of reminded, in a strange way, it sort of reminded us of what George Bush said about the invasion of Iraq, except that I think the Americans at that time were genuinely convinced that there was an Iraqi interest in nuclear weapons. Then there was another episode, which was on the 27th, a referendum in Belarus, allowing for a possible stationing of nuclear weapons in Belarusian territory. It was something new and somewhat foreshadowed, understandably so, by the war itself. But it means if Russia and Belarus agree, they could now not only the station of nuclear weapons on Belarusian territory, but also perhaps some forms of nuclear sharing between the two countries. So when I say that I believe the risk of Russian nuclear use is minimal or at least vastly overestimated, my main argument is that what Russia has been saying and doing since the beginning of the war has been, one, entirely consistent with Russian nuclear doctrine, and two, not particularly aggressive in terms of force posture. On point one, what some have called nuclear saber rattling, when you look very closely at the official statements, and I'm talking about the official Russian statements, not the completely wild commentary in the Russian official media, which is actually very aggressive and often threatening. So maybe this is some kind of division of labor between the Kremlin on the one hand, the Russian official media on the other. But the fact is that whenever Vladimir Putin or Sergei Lavrov or Mr. Peskov, the spokesperson of the Kremlin, talk about the Russian nuclear deterrent, they do it in a way which is, I think, not aggressive and just what I call a deterrence reminder. Russia has nuclear weapons, the biggest nuclear weapons arsenal in the world. And when Russian leaders refer to it, have been referring to it since February the 14th, it has been just to remind the world of the existence of this arsenal, and also to recall that the Russian nuclear doctrine only allows for nuclear use at certain points. There are 4 stated thresholds, and one of them, and the most important probably, is that if this is a conventional war, as it is now, Russia would use nuclear weapons, would consider using nuclear weapons only if, quote, its existence was threatened, unquote. So is the existence of Russia threatened today? Well, clearly not. And again, there's been no indication stated in those statements that Russia could consider the use of nuclear weapons at this point. Regarding nuclear posture, and that's the second argument, I have not seen anything that could indicate that Russia was somewhat willing to show the world that it could use nuclear weapons. There have been no recorded movements westwards of nuclear assets. And regarding the now very famous statement of Mr. Putin on February the 27th, this was not a decision to put forces on high alert. This was a decision to what the Russians call put the forces on special combat duty, and that just meant basically putting more people in the headquarters staff of strategic forces on a permanent basis. Also, something which has not been widely noted is that this decision of February the 27th was actually regarding all strategic forces, including defensive forces. And I am sometimes tempted to say that maybe one of the reasons why Mr. Putin made that decision and made it very public is that he actually may have feared some form of offensive against Russia by the West. Now, this may seem a bit far-fetched when I talk about this hypothesis in my government colleagues and other experts in Europe. People sometimes scratch their heads and say, do you really think so? I would say, well, yes. When you look at the history of Soviet and Russian nuclear policy and strategic policy in general, there is a lot of paranoia. And the Soviets, for instance, were convinced that the West was out to get them and that there was a risk that we actually would invade them. Whereas, of course, we in the West were terrified that the Soviet Union could attack us. So there's a long history of Russian nuclear paranoia and Soviet nuclear paranoia, which lead me to say that perhaps actually, the Russian leaders and Mr. Putin in particular actually feared, genuinely feared an attack on their territory. Regarding the deterrence game in the Ukraine war, I think it's fair to say that deterrence failed first, not nuclear deterrence, but Western deterrence failed. It's important to note that because deterrence is not a foolproof game, and we tried to deter Russia from invading Ukraine by threatening as early as September, October 2021, by threatening, quote, massive sanctions, unquote. And obviously that failed, that deterrent threat failed. And that's something we need to ponder when we think about the efficiency of deterrence in general. Clearly, either Mr. Putin did not believe that we would resort to massive economic sanctions, or he did not fear such sanctions, or he believed that the asymmetry of stakes, as we say in strategic circles, was such that even with the threat of sanctions, he could not afford to not invade Ukraine. I'm just laying down a hypothesis, and it's very difficult to understand exactly why and how deterrence fails in various crises, especially so closely after the fact. But whatever the answer is and whatever one's beliefs are regarding this particular issue, I think it is noteworthy to consider to remind people that February the 24th was a deterrence failure. Now, we have an expression in French which was forged by a French expert a long time ago, which we call aggressive sanctuarization. Aggressive sanctuarization means that a country is protected by its nuclear weapons to the point that it can actually embark in foreign adventures, such as the Ukraine war. And this is probably, although it's impossible to prove, this is probably what happened in the Ukraine war. Now, obviously, you cannot prove it, but certainly the possession of nuclear weapons offered Russia a level of comfort that was probably important for it to make the decision to embark in this. I think it's a crazy adventure which Russia lose, but that's a different topic. And overall, after the beginning of what Russia calls a special military operation, not only has Russia been rather cautious regarding nuclear deterrence statement, but the West has done the same. So in a sense, you could say that we are in a situation which is somewhat analogous or reminiscent of the crisis of the Cold War, in which there are indirect conflicts between two major nuclear armed adversaries, but with both adversaries being somewhat cautious, showing caution about some certain limits that they should not cross. Case in point, Russia has never attacked a country, a Western country protected by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. Case in point, the United States and Europe refrained from direct involvement, direct military involvement in Ukraine, and have even refused to impose a no-fly zone. This was one of the ideas floated around in late February, early March, for fear that it would leave them, that it could lead them to actually engage in air combat against Russia. So it's again a hypothesis, because in nuclear deterrence there are many things you cannot prove definitely. The only thing that you can prove is things that do not happen, that is, no nuclear use. But I think there are good grounds to say that overall nuclear weapons have probably contributed to a certain amount of restraint the contenders. Reminder that Western countries are not parties to the conflict, but of course they have massive military assistance to Ukraine, and their intelligence gathering and intelligence given to Ukraine makes them indirect participants, so to say. Now, what does this all mean for the future? Well, it's of course too early to say, because the Ukraine war is far from over, unfortunately. I personally believe, and I've stated it for weeks, that the chances of this war getting into 2023 are pretty high, and maybe it would last even longer than that. So I cannot offer definitive conclusions about the role of nuclear weapons during the Ukraine war, as long as the war is not over. But I think there will be lessons drawn from the war. Again, one of them is to say that deterring Russia is difficult in general, at least when we try by threatening massive economic sanctions, we failed. Another lesson that could be drawn by various parties around the world from the war is that nuclear weapons are helpful because they help you embark in foreign adventures in your neighborhood or elsewhere. It's once again too early to say exactly how this will be seen around the world, because the strategic perceptions are difficult to discuss and to predict. Now, regarding the consequences of well, before I get into the consequences for non-proliferation and disarmament, I should say a word about the lingering remaining risk of Russian nuclear use. There is a scenario in which Russia, I believe, could think about nuclear use in Ukraine. It's not the scenario where it would be defeated on the battlefield, but it's the scenario where it is actually threatened by Ukraine, who, in a hypothetical circumstance where Ukraine has reconquered the Donbass, the parts of the Ukrainian territory which have been occupied since 2014, and then decides to try to reconquer Crimea. And Crimea is, as you know, considered by Russia as Russian territory. Now, according to international law, it is not a Russian territory, it is Ukrainian territory, and most of the world considers that the legitimate boundaries, borders of Ukraine actually include Crimea. But nevertheless, Crimea is considered by the Kremlin as Russian territory. So what if, in a hypothetical scenario where Ukraine has reconquered the Donbass, Russia is being defeated pretty much, and now Ukrainians want to reconquer Crimea? Now, this is a scenario where I think we would see, at the very least, some nuclear saber rattling by Russia. Now, could Russia consider that the reconquest of Crimea by Ukraine is something that threatens the very existence of Russia, one of the stated thresholds of Russian first use? It's a possibility. At least I'm trying to warn my friends and colleagues around the world that this is a scenario that we need to think about. I'm not sure, by the way, that the United States and Europe would actually be ready to actively support the reconquest of Crimea, because in particular of that risk, because we would see then some probably threatening Russian statements regarding the risk of nuclear use. But Mr. Putin has already mentioned that scenario in a sense. He said when he met with French President Macron in early February, he said that if Ukraine was in NATO, then there would be a risk that NATO tries to reconquer Crimea for Ukraine, and then you would get into a conflict with Russia, which is a nuclear power, which is an indirect way to say that in the Crimea scenario, then there would be some heightened heightened risk of nuclear use. I'm not saying that if Ukraine recovered Crimea, then it would be a nuclear war. That's definitely not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that as compared to the current risk of nuclear use by Russia, which I think is extremely low, then the risk, the calculation of risk would be different in that scenario, and we collectively need to think about it. Among the consequences, then going back to the consequences for deterrence, there's one thing which is clear, in addition to the overall validation, rightly or wrongly, of the possession of nuclear weapons by Russia and the West, it's the validation of nuclear sharing. Nuclear sharing is, as you know, the procedure through which a non-nuclear state is actually able to use another country's nuclear weapons. And this is a procedure that has existed in NATO for a long time, as most of you know very well. And clearly, the procedure has been validated by the Ukraine war from NATO's standpoint, to the point that actually Poland is now saying that it would be ready to host US nuclear weapons on its territory. Now, up until now, the US nuclear weapons that are part of the nuclear sharing procedures are only based in a few Western countries, which were already hosted those weapons during the Cold War. And there has been a deliberate decision taken. There was a deliberate decision taken in the late 90s to not put nuclear weapons on the territory of Eastern members. This was seen at the time as a reassurance measure designed to avoid Russia to feel threatened and provoked. Now, this decision may be revoked in the future. It's not clear. There has not been a decision to do it, but clearly these assurances that were given to Russia informally and unilaterally by NATO will probably no longer exist. New members of NATO may be interested in joining the nuclear procedure. I'm talking about Finland and Sweden. I doubt it will be the case, but at least they will now participate in NATO nuclear policy debates and discussions. And on the Russian side, well, Russia is now saying that it is getting ready to consider once again, as was the case at the time of the Warsaw Pact in the Cold War, it is ready to consider once again nuclear sharing with another country. That country would be Belarus. 3 weeks ago, there was a joint press conference by President Lukashenko and President Putin, and President Lukashenko clearly showed his interest in having his aircraft in particular being able to carry Russian nuclear weapons. I don't think Russia will deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus, certainly not in peacetime. But certainly the interest shown by the two leaders in reviving nuclear sharing is something which shows a new development. Regarding the consequences for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, let me make 2 or 3 points. One, clearly, this is not a good time for nuclear disarmament. There is more interest in nuclear deterrence than nuclear disarmament in the Euro-Atlantic space today. But I'm not excluding that if Russia emerged from the Ukraine war seriously weakened, military and economically, it may be interested in some forms of arms control, in rejuvenating a nuclear arms control effort with the United States, because it might be in its own interest. States don't do arms control because arms control is fundamentally a good thing. States do that mostly because they think it's good for their own security. So if the Russian armed forces emerge from the Ukraine war severely weakened, then Russia could be more interested in rejuvenating nuclear arms control than it is today. Regarding proliferation, well, there is going to be a powerful narrative throughout the world, which is the one according to which, and I'm opening big quotation marks here, once again, a country which had given up its nuclear program was attacked. Therefore, if you want to protect yourself, you need to have nuclear weapons. And that list would include Iraq, Libya, perhaps Syria, and now Ukraine, because Ukraine had given up its nuclear weapons, even though they were not really its nuclear weapons. They were Soviet nuclear weapons it had inherited from its territory. But that narrative could be a powerful argument in countries which have already embarked in weapons related nuclear program, and I'm talking about Iran, of course. North Korea is a different category. North Korea is now a full-fledged nuclear country, not in the sense of the NPT, but clearly I think it has moved from the proliferation category to the category of de facto nuclear weapon states. So perhaps this argument, as maybe because this narrative could be debated, but at least it exists, and perceptions matter a lot in international security. So this narrative could be a powerful argument in countries that may be interested in a nuclear weapons program. Now, I hasten to say that I don't think this will be a giant boost for nuclear proliferation, but just an additional argument in the domestic debates in countries which may be interested in a nuclear weapons program. Tragically for non-proliferation, and I will end my presentation afterwards, security assurances have been delegitimized by the Russian violation of its own security assurances. In 1994, as you may know, in Budapest, the Soviet Union, Russia, along with Western countries, gave to Ukraine assurances, negative assurances, or positive assurances, depends how you frame, that having renounced nuclear weapons, now Ukraine will benefit from assurances that the signatories would respect their territorial integrity and sovereignty. So it's important because it goes back to the question of what is the costs and benefits of retaining nuclear weapons and having a nuclear weapons program. And the Russians have egregiously violated their own security assurances by invading Ukraine, because this so-called special military operation is no less than a full-scale invasion. So unfortunately, I think this will downgrade the value of such positive assurances and make a country think twice next time when it is considering giving up its nuclear weapons program. So overall, I think my assessment of the military nuclear dimension of the Ukraine war is both positive and negative, optimistic and pessimistic. Rather optimistic regarding the risk of actual nuclear use by Russia, and a bit more pessimistic regarding the consequences of the Ukraine war for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Even though, once again, and it's not a rhetorical point, it is too early to say, because unfortunately for the Ukrainians and for the world, because we are very much aware here in Europe of the consequences for food security around the world. Unfortunately, this war is far from over. So maybe in a year from now, if I do the same kind of presentation, I may have very different conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno, for such an outstanding synopsis of such difficult and happening scenario. It is really fascinating to see how one episode in the global politics becomes such a grand game changer. And we already have one hand raised, while the rest of you are scripting your questions My request once again would be to keep your questions short, not rhetorical, no comments, so that you can have maximum responses from our speaker. Sikandar, kindly unmute yourself, and you can also turn on your video.
Assalamu alaikum and good morning. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
My name is Khan and I am a research fellow at Baluchistan Think Tank Network. My question to Dr. Bruno would be, what are the Russian objectives behind the military intervention in Ukraine? Whether Western sanctions can prove effective as an
I don't know if other participants are in the same situation, but I did not hear Sikandar's
Sikandar, we
one.
missed the second point of your question. After sanctions, can you please repeat what you were saying?
Of the Western sanctions, as they apply, can prove effective and as an instrument to counter the Russian act. Similarly, how does it affect the strategic environment in South Asian region?
So 2 questions, right?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Should I, Salma,
Bruno, would you
answer?
like to have 1 question at a time, or would you like a couple more?
Well, maybe this is actually a big question, and so maybe I would answer this one first, if that's okay. Russian objectives. Well, Russian objectives are rather clear in the sense of their overall strategic purpose. The idea is to prevent Ukraine from existing as a fully functional sovereign state. That's the overall objective. This includes preventing Ukraine from making its own sovereign strategic choices by getting closer to the European Union and NATO and the West in general. A reminder, by the way, of some have been saying that this was all about NATO enlargement, that Putin can stand it anymore, etc. But you have to remember that in 2014, people who were demonstrating in Kiev were not waving NATO flags, they were waving EU flags. So I think that for Russia, the problem is in fact more the EU than NATO in reality. It's about having your most important neighbor drifting away from you. Ukraine is actually a very important part of Russia's history. Ukraine is now a sovereign state, and Russia has accepted on paper weakening Ukraine by maintaining it in a state of war and by absorbing or at least allowing some parts territory to become independent, as will be maybe the case for the two self-declared Republic of Donbass. But the overall objective, I think, you get the picture. Regarding sanctions, so I'm of two minds about sanctions. I think sanctions have become overall some kind of knee-jerk reaction in many of our governments. So there's a problem, we need to have sanctions. So we don't always think through very carefully the actual strategic objective that we are trying to achieve with sanctions. Now, sanctions before the fact, threat of sanctions was actually threat of sanctions had actually a very clear goal, which was preventing Russia from invading Ukraine. Imposing sanctions has several objectives. First of all, there is a symbolic objective. We need to show that crime does not pay, and it is a crime that Russia is committing. So there's a symbolic dimension to it, which may have a deterrent value for others. Then obviously, the idea the general idea behind imposing sanctions is to make the cost of invasion increasingly costly for Russia, to the point that at some point it may give up. Now, this is not something which is designed to stop the war right now. Absolutely not. Nobody thought that by imposing 5, 6, and maybe now 7 sets of sanctions, the EU was going to stop the Russian armed forces dead still in their tracks. No, but it's a longer term objective affecting the Russian calculations about continuing this war. Now, the effects on South Asia, it's a good question. I have not really thought about it. However, I think there is a narrative, a Russian narrative, which is unfortunately somewhat popular throughout the world, which is that the food security situation is due to Western sanctions. Now, this is a narrative that Russia has been pushing around the world, and nothing could be further far from the truth. This is absolutely nonsense. The reality is that, well, there are 2 issues. There's the price of energy and the price of food. The price of energy, for instance, when you look at the price of Russian gas on the market, you realize that Russia has manipulated the price of gas on the market beginning in September, before the invasion. The price of gas is slowly rising due to that Russian strategy. Now, regarding food security and the price of food, obviously the Russian de facto blockade of Ukrainian ports is what is driving the prices up. So it has pretty much nothing to do with sanctions. So the war reverberates throughout the world, has an impact on food security, but it's not directed with, it's not connected with sanctions. I see now 3 other questions. Maybe I should stop there to have the time to address the others. Some.
Okay, thank you so much. Just a food for thought in case someone else does not bring up the same question. And that is that sanctions, if they are applied selectively, may not also have that great an impact, a punitive impact or a compliance impact, so to speak. So I'll just leave this as a food for thought because we already have 3 participants and a 4th who has asked a question. Cheyenne, kindly turn on your mic and your video.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. And thank you to Mr. Bruno for the lecture. So, sir, my question is that you mentioned Russia's nuclear posture, that it states that in case of an existential threat, it might justify the use of nuclear weapons. But also you mentioned that, it's a very vague term as well, that, it could be used by Russia and Putin, in certain ways. So, sir, I wanted to ask that not just Russia, but for any state, how important is the nuclear posture in a war-like scenario? Is that even relevant in a war? That's it.
Perhaps, Salma, we could take several questions.
That's exactly what I was also thinking. But Cheyenne, you can turn off your video. Murad, can we have your mic on? Murad Ali.
Thank you, ma'am, for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. And thank you, Dr. Bruno, for your nice and insightful presentation. My question is regarding the expansion of NATO and European Unions to the border of Russia. Dr. Bruno, don't you think that Russia has already visualized its territorial security doctrine that if Ukraine listed part of European Union NATO, Russia would react aggressively? Don't you think the US along with West miscalculated the action of joining Ukraine, try to insist Ukraine to join the European Union or NATO? Thank you.
Shall we take a 3rd question as well?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Alina, can you switch on your mic? Alina Afzal, you have already written a question. Otherwise, I'll give the chance to Imran Abbas and I'll ask the question myself. Imran Abbas, kindly unmute yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Salma. It's a pleasure to see you again. And thank you, Dr. Bruno. My question is that the calculus of strategic need is supported by the nuclear force string versus the media-based saber rattling and supported by the fake news is creating a all complexity of Russian nuclear deterrence, whether it will be workable or the Russian active nuclear forces will be involved. But in case if there is a case of use of chemical or biological weapon, because Ukraine will get whatever it gets from wherever it gets, use of chemical and biological weapon against the Russian forces, or even the attempt to target the Russian nuclear forces in Russia or Belarus, what you will see that it would change the overall nuclear posturing of Russia, despite it has a doctrine. And secondly, you being the French, sir, I want to know in that particular case whether the Europeans will like to have a quid pro quo strategy and allowing the US nuclear forces to be present in the context. Thank you.
Perhaps Salma could take those three.
Absolutely, please do.
Okay, Cheyenne's question is very broad, so it's difficult to answer in just a few seconds. But I would say that broadly speaking, and I don't think that this is something that other experts would disagree with, the possession of nuclear weapons always affects a country's leaders' state of mind and thinking. How exactly and to what extent requires getting into the heads of those who are in charge of nuclear weapons and who could actually decide on their use. So it's something very difficult. Nevertheless, there have been so many testimonies and crises around the world since 1945 that you can draw some preliminary conclusion. I would say that generally speaking, the possession of nuclear weapons allows for two kinds of reaction. One is aggressiveness, the other is caution. So it may be a sort of a paradox because nuclear weapons often have multiple and different consequences. Aggressiveness, this is what I referred to earlier on at what the French sometimes call aggressive sanctuarization. You feel protected behind your nuclear umbrella, therefore you feel confident doing things you may have not done otherwise because you feel protected. At the same time, there's also prudence or caution. My personal take, looking at the history of the world since 1945, is that, and it's good news, that overall heads of state and governments have reacted to the possession of nuclear weapons with a lot of caution and prudence. In wartime, including, by the way, in South Asia, I think that overall in wartime or in crisis time, there is more than rattling, so to say. Of course, there are statements. You know, I have nuclear weapons. The world should be careful. My neighbor be careful, etc. Yes, there are statements. But I think my reading of the crisis that have had, which involve at least one nuclear weapon possessor, especially when there are two, is that they have lowered the temperature of the crisis more than heightened it. Again, I'm saying that this is of course debated, but I am clearly on the side of those who believe that overall nuclear weapons have had more positive consequences than negative one for crisis. Regarding the question by Murad, you used the word expansion, and of course that's a word which has been widely used. I like to think that I like to say that it works more the other way around. Since 1990, it has been more countries willing to get into these institutions than a deliberate project by these institutions to expand. So the expansion is a fact, but it's much more a fact than a strategy. When you look, for instance, at Finland and Sweden would not have joined NATO, or at least not for a very long time, had there not been for Russian aggression. It's kind of a paradox or an undesirable effect for Russia. Then now they're going to have it into a country which has 1,400 kilometers with Russian territory. Precisely the sort of things that Russia said or claimed it does not like. I was referring to Finland. So did we miscalculate? Okay, I think this requires an elaborate answer. First of all, I think that in 2008, when NATO said that they could one day open the door to Ukraine and Georgia, this was in retrospect a bad decision, because we did two things. We said that Ukraine and Georgia could be members of NATO, but we said certainly not now. So it opened the space for Putin to attack those countries, as he did, to attack countries because they were not yet protected by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. So in a sense, it would have been better. I know it's always easy to say outside expert, but it would have been better to say either they may want to get to NATO, so we are ready to protect them immediately, which would probably have made Mr. Putin pause, or to say nothing. So this is a long way to say that the West does make mistakes, and I think this was a mistake. However, once again, you have to go back to the basics. Ukraine is an independent, sovereign country, recognized as such by the United Nations, by Europe, by the United States, and by Russia. Once again, it's important. Russia had recognized the borders of Ukraine, its independence and sovereignty multiple times since 1990. This is what makes the aggression unbearable. Now, should the EU have said, we're not interested in doing business with you, we're not interested in you becoming more democratic, more developed, less corrupt, because we fear that this may be seen as provocative by Moscow. What a tragedy it would have been. What a tragedy it would have been for Ukraine, for instance, in particular. But I think that also this would not have prevented Mr. Putin from being aggressive, because you don't appease a bully. If you appease a bully, the bully believes that it can do more. So is there a cause and effect here? Yes, to some extent. Was it a mistake by the EU and NATO to take into account the desires of an independent country to get closer to us? I don't think so. Now, regarding Imran's question, finally, the use of chemical weapons by Russia would certainly change the picture. But my very deeply held belief is that it would not lead the West to consider the use of nuclear weapons. It may lead the West to consider a more militarily aggressive posture towards Russia. It would depend on the scope of such attacks. It would be very, very difficult for the West to maintain our hands off, or at least no direct active involvement in Ukraine, military involvement in Ukraine, if there ever was some massive chemical weapons used by Russia. And if I understood your question, one of your hypotheses was about a NATO threat against Russian nuclear weapons, and I don't think this is absolutely. In such scenarios, your question was also about Europe. I think if there was the slightest risk of nuclear use anywhere, Europeans would be much more guarded than the United States, or even more guarded than the United States, except for maybe France and the UK. But several European countries would be so terrified by the risk of nuclear use that they could break ranks with us. I see we only have something like 7-8 minutes left. So Salma, you decide which questions we take and in what order.
Okay, we actually have two participants who have raised questions in the chat line. One question is common to both of them. The participants are Alina Afzal, who's a student of BSIR at Air University. And the other participant is Jawad Ali Shah, both of them who's from CISS Sindh. So you have an audience comprising of the entire Pakistan. Well, the first question both of them have in common is, how do you see this war coming to an end? And Alina's second follow-up question is, what do the countries involved end up gaining from this conflict in the future? Whereas Jawad's question is that, do you think the Western military support to Ukraine can actually help Ukraine in the longer run? So these are the two questions that I've received virtually. And then I will request Usman Karim and Sarah Nazir to ask their questions. And these are the last two questions that we are entertaining. Usman, kindly. Short, brief, to the point.
Thank you, ma'am. My question is that don't you think that if Ukraine continues to regain its territory back, it will create frustration in Russia, and it may look to use it in nuclear weapons?
Fine. Sarah? Sorry, Amna, we can't have your question. We are short on time. Sarah Nazir?
Assalamu alaikum.
Gigi, please ask your question.
My question is, should Ukraine go for the acquisition of nuclear weapons by keeping in mind of the effectiveness of nuclear deterrence? Please share your opinion on this.
Okay.
Short and
If you
swift.
just allow me, I think Amna, just ask the question and then we are stopping the line.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. As we know that Russian invasion of Ukraine and the attendant nuclear intervention have already potentially have significant consequences on certain nuclear balances at global level. Sir, I want to know about your stance on the US and Russian relationship, especially with the reference of the New START treaty, for how this Ukraine crisis will affect their nuclear treaties relationship.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruno, for entertaining all the questions. Please. Bruno, you are muted.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
should not happen after 2 years of Zoom. I'll first take the first two questions because they are somewhat related. Because certainly Western military assistance to Ukraine has allowed Ukraine to resist Russian armed forces much more than it would have been the case otherwise. I'm not saying that the Ukrainian army is not brave, it's competent and efficient. I think it is very brave and competent and efficient. But that is, without Western military assistance to Ukraine, the chances, the probability of a collapse of Ukraine was certainly a scenario that could have happened. How does this end? Okay, three things. First, I may refer, if I may, I will refer you to a piece that I wrote in English for the Montaigne Institute, which is available precisely on their website, and which is precisely on the 5 scenarios, where I make 5 analogies. And one is related. I'm trying to make an analogy with Kashmir, Crimea, Kashmir, actually. And it's available on the Institut Montaigne website. But overall, I would say, and this is my second point, first, we don't know when this ends, and does not end now. That's almost a certainty. It's going to go continue for months. Third point, overall, the chances of a scenario favorable to Ukraine are higher than a scenario favorable to Russia. Ukraine is highly motivated because this country is actually endangered. Ukraine is now overall fairly efficient militarily speaking because of Western military assistance. And Russia is facing very severe equipment and manpower deficiencies. When you raise the age of joining the armed forces to 65, when you ask each and every district in the Federation of Russia to commit at least 400 people, you're in trouble. When you have all the T-72 Soviet tanks being taken away from mothballing to get into the field, it shows that you are in trouble. So Russia's advantage is that it is a dictatorship, so it can actually stand a level of pain which is higher certainly than in some other countries. So I think Mr. Putin is in for the long game. He's not facing the risk of a revolution, but overall, this is going to get harder and harder for Russia. So the scenarios favorable to Ukraine are more probable. Frustration in Russia, could it lead to the use of nuclear weapons? Well, frustration in Russia is already exists, I can tell you, including in the Kremlin. But it's very difficult for me to imagine circumstances where Mr. Putin would think that because he's frustrated, he needs to use nukes. Once again, Mr. Putin may done some absurd things from time to time, but there are two things regarding which he is very careful about. One is not attacking militarily a NATO Article 5 covered country. And the other is, appearing irresponsible with nuclear weapons. So I think this risk is extremely low. Sarah's question regarding Ukraine, it's a good question. I think that what Ukraine wants is some forms of security guarantees. And it believes that getting closer to the West economically and militarily is increasingly a de facto nuclear guarantee. I think Ukraine is also very much aware that if it made the foolish decision to embark in a nuclear weapons program, the West could not help it anymore. There is no chance that the United States and Europe would help Ukraine to the point that they are doing now if Ukraine was actually getting into a nuclear weapons program. This is it's the same thing, by the way, when people said, oh, Ukraine should have kept its nuclear weapons. Yeah, but the problem is that had Ukraine kept the Soviet nuclear weapons it had, then there is no way we would have had the same relationship with them. And maybe Ukraine would have been much more vulnerable to Russian blackmail and influence. So it's always difficult to deal with counterfactuals. But the short answer to your question is that no, there is no serious Ukrainian interest in nuclear weapons. And finally, for Amna's question on New START, I think both parties will continue to implement New START because it's relatively cost-free from a political standpoint. Unless there is a pushback in the United States, Imagine, for instance, that in November there is the election is overwhelmingly a Republican victory. Then maybe there will be some voices saying, "Hey, we should put New START to the dustbin." But for now, both parties, the US and Russia, believe that it's, despite the war, their own interest to maintain at least this instrument, which has been still in existence for a few years.
Right. Wow, that was a lot of information packed in 1 hour's time. And thank you so much, Bruno, for taking this time out, and Staff Asia, as well as Frederick Ebert Stiftung, for facilitating this entire process, because we all emerge a lot wiser, because there are many myths that you have broken, primarily starting from the last point that you say that had Ukraine maintained its nuclear weapons, or the inherited nuclear weapons, if we try to invent a new term, it might not have really helped it out. This is a counter narrative to what we staunchly believe in Pakistan. And we really feel that nuclear weapons were the solid guarantee, are the solid guarantee for us, and that would have also helped Ukraine. So this is scenario building, so to speak, but how these things would turn out. And would the world emerge wiser at the end of this possible war, or would we be plunging into something very different, is a question that we need to see in the coming days. For the moment, the common people are looking at Ukrainian war in terms of food security, as well as the expenses that we are all bearing as a result of that. Faraz has already opened his video window, which means that I should hold my peace, keep quiet, so that Faraz can do the serious talking. But on behalf, as the moderator, thank you so much, Bruno, for joining us in this session and for sparing time. God bless. Over to Faraz.
Just if I may, just a few words of thanks to Straphasia, to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and to the participants. I look forward to my next visit to Pakistan to discuss these issues further. Thank you very much.
We are so absolutely looking forward to your trip. Thank you. Thank you. And please, everyone, stay online. If Bruno is signing off, that doesn't mean that you guys need to sign off. Please stay online. Faraz, over to you.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, Mr. Bruno, again so much for taking your time out. And yes, we definitely do look forward to having you, hosting you even in person. That'd be even better. And just from the small discussion that we were able to have, a longer discussion would be even more insightful. So thank you again. And yes, to the participants, do stay online. We'll carry on with an interactive discussion session, a bit more in depth. And Dr. Adil, would you like to say a few words?
No, thank you. My apologies that I think Bruno has signed off now. Anyway, I'll thank him personally. Over to Dr. Salma. Thank you very much, Dr. Salma, for moderating it excellently. Over in your hands. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have our participants here. We have Adil, we have Faraz, and I did see Mr. Praveen Swami joining us, but I think he has signed off. But let us have a quick round of discussion. And here I would invite you people, those of you who can turn on their videos, they're more than welcome to do that. But please keep yourself muted so that there's not a lot of noise factor. But in case there's an issue with the videos and the streaming, then follow your instinct. Starting with the last point that Bruno has mentioned here about the security guarantee that nuclear weapons provide us. And going back to the classic debate of having more nuclear weapons is a better option in maintaining stability and world peace. Another advocate of that we found in our speaker today, rather than having lesser nuclear weapons and more emphasis on a subjective, what I would actually call a subjective responsibility scenario. Let's have your opinions on that. Do you actually think that hypothetically, if Ukraine had maintained these inherited nuclear weapons, but also please do keep in mind the conditionality that Bruno has mentioned here, and that is that all the positive Western press and Western support that Ukraine is receiving at the moment is by virtue of its going non-nuclear. So would that have helped Ukraine? Would that have helped or prevented Russia from doing this adventurism? And the point that Bruno has a new term that he has coined for us, the aggressive sanctuarization. Could Ukraine actually indulge in any kind of aggressive sanctuarization in that regard? So your point. Faraz, you have your hands up already. Please kindly go ahead.
I mean, after the point that Mr. Bruno made, I think I agree with him in the sense of how an adversary, how threat perceptions work. Let's say Ukraine did have nuclear weapons, and Russia historically would not have wanted Ukraine to keep those nuclear weapons. So if it did have that technology, Russia's aggressiveness, which it took 30 odd years after the breakup of the Soviet Union to act this way, that sort of situation may have happened much before. And then also more, or just on a broader level, whether a country should have nuclear weapons if it doesn't already. No, because it has sort of a domino effect, right? Like if you're in an adversarial relationship in your region, then the acquisition of nuclear weapons by that one country will will prompt its adversary, or who thinks that that country is an adversary, to figure out some way to go down that same path. And the similar kind of situation happened, and we see that in South Asia, is, why did country B work towards nuclear weapons? Because country A was working towards it, and you automatically, even just on an individual level, if you think someone is my adversary, they're getting this weapon, you will try to do that same thing. So had Ukraine done that, it would have made it into a state that the other countries around it in Europe may not have wanted to support it in the same way. So I think Mr. Bruno made a really good point that the entire scenario and the entire situation would have been different had it either kept those nuclear weapons, or if it had decided to pursue that technology after the fact.
Okay, thank you, Faraz, for opening an interesting discussion point. I've also, in the chat forum, shared the link to Bruno's article that he was talking about, the institute for which he's working. My French is atrocious, so I'm not even thinking of spelling the name of that institution. But here he has given 5 scenarios, Nagorno-Karabakh, Kashmir, and other scenarios in which he has compared Crimea as well as the Ukrainian aspect. Okay, another scenario has been put forward in the chat box, which was actually a question to Bruno by Dr. Imran Abbas. So Imran, you already have your hands up. I would like you to go next.
Thank you, Dr. Salma. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So so look at the point which Dr. Bruno made. It's very interesting. If we look at the French history and de Gaulle's famous remark of trading Paris for New York and then going for an independent nuclear program, and it's more imperative to actually look at the scenario in a case that if the war stops, whether Ukraine will follow the same path for going for an independent nuclear program, because it have had the experience of not having a nuclear weapon and then facing the consequence, then to have a nuclear weapon and not facing the consequence. And even if the Europeans or the NATO supports Ukraine or not supports Ukraine, it's the history that teaches the lesson. And I wonder that how many people in Ukraine would be favoring the notion that we should have a nuclear weapon, or had we had the nuclear weapon before the crisis, Russian would have remained limited to those eastern Ukrainian areas and maybe doing the real special operations instead of invading and sending the whole military into Ukraine and even targeting the Kyiv. So that's the scenario. I mean, the French lesson itself is actually opposite to what Dr. Bruno suggested about the Ukraine. That's the one point. And the second point, which I feel that Dr. Bruno couldn't take it out, is the use of the chemical or biological weapons against the Russian forces. What would the change it would bring to the Russian nuclear posturing, or maybe hitting the targets within Belarusia? Then the scenario would be entirely changed. So it's the perspective that the Europeans always take pride to actually favor non-nuclear or nuclear proliferation, not in the sense that it should be proliferated elsewhere to secure conflict avoidance. Instead, there should be some guarantees offered by the big powers, and the newer protocols and conventions should be there, where there should be like the Dr. Bruno had himself referred to the case where Russia had actually given in 1994 the guarantees to the Ukraine, and then Ukraine has to face this crisis. So what would be the lesson being learned by the other countries would be very interesting to the overall nuclear proliferation, or rather non-proliferation drive. That's my comment to overall the situation.
Okay, right. Thank you, Dr. Imran. That's a lot of provocation on your part. People, wake up and make a response. And I'm now donning not only a moderator's chair, but the tutorial teacher that I have been, and I'm going to ask my ex-student, Samran Ali, to say something.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
I was actually sitting outside, so I just came here to speak. I think
खाना तो नहीं खा रहे थे
Ukraine.
आप?
No, I was not eating food. I was having tea.
Okay, please go ahead.
I think Ukraine would have been at a stronger position if it had retained its nuclear weapons, because I think it had the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons. It would have taken some time to actually develop command and control of them, but even if it has retained them, it had a stronger position with Russia. Even if it wanted to join NATO, it could have joined, such as like other countries. France had, like UK, both countries are within NATO, but have their own independent nuclear weapons. Similarly, Ukraine, maybe hypothetically, it could have been a third country other than the US. Then the Russian actually response to Ukraine membership to NATO may not be this strong, like full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So it would have been different. And if we talk about the media perception, then maybe if Ukraine was a weaker state as compared to Russia, then maybe we can say that the media would also have some treated Ukraine like this, the Western media, as compared to the Russian, Soviet Russian legacy, whatever. So thank you.
Yeah, right. Thanks. And there's also this aspect about the media, how the media is building up the case, and contemporary wars are more a media-based war than wars than otherwise. So from the use of chemical weapons to how effectively media runs the war, today's wars are actually a mix of several things. And also, do keep in mind the point that Sarah as well as Jawad had raised about how the war is going to terminate. This is actually a very fascinating case because it is always very easy to initiate a war, which is an ancient Italian proverb, but it is very difficult to terminate it. Usually, those who are terminating the war are not the ones who initiated them. So that becomes extremely different. So Faraz has actually asked all of you, please raise your hands, join the conversation. If there's any point that you people want to put on the table, please do that. Dr. Imran.
Thank you very much. So my point, the second point is, you've seen that the Ukrainians have been able to destroy one of the Russian cruisers. And if they continue to do so in this way, like, hitting a battleship or destroying or sinking a bigger ship will actually creates more an effect than losing a few kilometers of territory or retreating in that sense. So that media buzz that is playing its part on the part of the Western European countries, where they're saying that actually the Ukrainians are winning, and while on the other side the Russians are saying that it's the Russians who are winning. In that case, as the time will progress, there will be some diplomatic efforts, and Russians would probably be opening up the channel if they are not been able to, or they wish to minimize the damage they are actually having on the battlefield. So then the diplomacy comes into account, and then the terms will be there to end the hostilities or terminate the engagements. And at that time, whether we will have a legacy of a protracted conflict, the dispute in itself, and a potential for another incursions, so that's going to last and haunt Europe for a longer period of time. So it's probably in the favor of both the Russians and the Europeans that they should decide and actually move towards ending the conflict once for all, and not leaving behind that legacy that we are having actually within the Pakistan-India context. As the case of the Kashmir, sometimes we say the Kashmir is like the agenda number one between Pakistan and India, and sometimes we say that it's an overall peace that we should look forward, and then it goes on and on to the other dynamics that plays part in Pakistan and India relation. Same could be the case where we have a conflict between an unending conflict and the claims and the political disputes, and then there's a chance for future military aggressions? Thank you.
Well, they definitely need something to fight about in future as well. So they would rather not throw in the towel and maintain some bleak window through which they can negatively intervene. Before I give the space to Sikandar, another point that Raz has raised, if any of you are not feeling very confident about talking on the Ukrainian issue, or you're not in a mood to talk about it, feel free to bring up another topic or a subtopic related to this, and we can definitely deliberate on that as well. Okay, before I give the chance to Sikandar, I would actually appreciate Alina. In case you cannot turn on your video, Alina, I would appreciate if you ask the question yourself so that we can hear you speak.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Ji walaikum salam.
I wanted to ask, as we can see, there's a lot of refugees entering into different countries in Europe, especially Poland, which is right next to Ukraine. So how is Ukraine sort of benefiting from this? Thank you.
Ukraine benefiting from this scenario, or Poland benefiting from? Hang on.
Poland.
Poland. Yeah. Okay. Anyone, any take on the refugees issue, which is a very, very important but a negative spin-off of any conflict? Displaced people, forcibly displaced people, who are whether internally displaced or who become refugees. This is a crisis that the world community is facing from the longest. So please, this is a food for thought, and we'll come back on that. Sikandar and Jamal. First Sikandar, then Jamal.
Assalamu alaikum. And I want to comment on something on Ukraine crisis, that there are two important things that we need to understand about the Ukraine crisis. First is the history, and second is the geography. They are the most important tools that we need to understand the Ukraine crisis. In history, Ukraine and the so-called Soviet Union and now Russia, they remain a common territory or empire in which they both have same common norms. Their territory or part, like USSR after its disintegration lost Ukraine. So it is very imminent that they would never, keeping in view the Russian hardcore behavior towards their neighbors and countries, that disassociated with them. Secondly, the geography. After the disintegration, like Poland, which is a buffer zone, Ukraine was made as a buffer state geographically to contain any aggressive actions from any major powers to directly hit Russia. So since the regime change after 2011 in Ukraine,
Sikandar, we are losing you. We can't hear you.
National interest. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. So that is the second point, that geographically where Russia is located, it wants some countries like Poland to safeguard its security. The another thing I want to mention, there is a great debate going on in current academia about national security and national survival that is linked to nuclear weapons. How nuclear weapons can prove effective in giving a country their in providing
Sikandar, I think perhaps we'll revert to you later. We have again lost you, but we'll revert to you later. Okay, Jamal.
Thanks, ma'am. Great session. I have just a little comment that in present era of emerging technologies, where precision weapons are available, countries should go for weaponry with emerging technology capability instead of going for nuclear capability. A country having sophisticated conventional weapon can neutralize its enemy at their silos, at their launching pads. So having burden of nuclearization and applying different safeguards, a country can survive and can retaliate and can protect its sovereignty and its pride by employing prudently conventional weapons, or I must say advanced conventional weapons augmented by emerging technologies. This is a food for thought.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important point. And I'm just noting these down. And after Murad has said his word, then let's take up all of these aspects that you people have raised, and then we will come back. Adila, okay, so first Murad, and then Adila. And in the next round, then I will ask Dr. Imran to have a word. Murad?
Thank you, ma'am. My point to raise is that the only way to manage or to address the current crisis situations between Russia and Ukraine is to somehow address the real or the fundamental anxiety, or you can say the issues or the threat perception that Russia is being dealing with toward its immediate neighbors or the eastern Ukraine. If you go back to the agreement that carved out between US and the then Soviet Union following the disintegrations of Russia, it was basically decided, and it was basically, the Russia was basically assured that the NATO entrenchment would not be carried out into the eastern Ukraine. And that was the condition that Russia basically gave permissions to allow independence to the then Soviet satellite state. So the main point that I want just to highlight is that the Russia concerns, they are understandable, that if the NATO come at its backyard and in the future somehow threaten it territorial integrity or sovereignty, so how would it like reacted, or how it would affect its national security? If you take the example of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Russia basically, the Soviet Union, they tried to plant the missile system in the Cuba, and how the US basically reacted. So the point is that the Russians' anxiety toward its border states is understandable, and the West should understand this fact and should not penetrate into the states which have been basically straddled at the border of Russia. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So that was Murad and Adila, and then I'll kind of have a response to this. Adila.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. It's a very great initiative by Russia, no doubt. Ma'am, I just want to make one point regarding a refugee issue, as you mentioned, that I observed as compare when Afghanistan war and with Ukraine, that level of solidarity and welcome in other countries differentiate this war from earlier war and conflicts. Likewise, refugees from previous crises are frequently forcefully turned away at borders. But when we see Ukrainians have received widespread and consistent support from a variety of countries, and they are always welcomed in solidarity by European countries as well. So I think it is critical to recognize that this is the Europe's largest armed struggle or war since World War II, I think, and which may be one of the reasons why European countries are more united. And when they talk about humanity, So it is more about national interest, as we see how Afghanis are suffering and how Pakistan pay cost of it. So this is my point. Thank you, ma'am.
Right. Thank you so much, Adila. Going in reverse, the point that Adila and Alina have both raised about the refugee issue, that is actually very fascinating to see how the selective reception to such moral aspects are. It is extremely true. The showcasing of the refugees that is happening with regards to Ukrainian refugees, or earlier on, a little bit in the thick of the heat about the Afghans who were seeking refuge and all. But now that we see virtually, it's like turning a new chapter every few months. And there's something new that the world is looking forward to, some new crisis, some new conflict. Had there been another international or not so international conflict producing this war collateral, the refugees, simultaneous to the Ukrainian crisis, then the comparison would have been very, very obvious. And the refugees in that crisis would not have received this type of a reception. So this is actually a kind of showcasing that moral responsibility and trying to demonize the other in this scenario. I'm quite sure after a couple of months, this positive reception that these refugees are facing in the Western capitals is also going to wane away a little bit. It's going to simmer down, and then it's going to become, for the lack of a better terminology that I may use, very base and very boring, because there are already too many migrants. But of course, it's also the white or the Western people entertaining Western people, rather not from other community, other cultures or other ethnic background. So it's a very, very mixed picture, and it's not something very simple and complicated. Unfortunately, many a times when we are looking at the developments in the international politics, we look at it from a singular lens. And many a times, young researchers, such as the most of you who are represented here, you take a very strong moralistic stand, which you should. You only become tinted when you become self-sufficient in the evils of the world, and you find out that there is very little when it comes to moralistic debate. So you take moralistic positions, but you don't profess in the international politics moralistic actions. And that, unfortunately, is the fate of the refugees as well. The Afghan refugees, for many of you who were not born in the 1970s and who don't even know about the first influx of the Afghan refugees into Pakistan in the 1970s, it was only Pakistan which was accommodating all of them, despite our economic position. And the Pakistani regime at that time, it was a military dictatorship. So, and General Ziaul Haq was a very deeply religious person. So he used the connotation of Muhajir and Ansar to legitimize the very, very heavy inflow of Afghan nationals into Pakistan. And people very much opened their homes to those people. But at the end of the day, a time comes when the host country also starts asking questions as to how much and how many. And this is something, and of course, with the Afghan refugees, it also became a problematic situation. So if you pick case by case, you will find this host and refugee population problem large becoming problematic everywhere. But this is taking the question in another direction. But what does Poland get out of hosting so many refugees? For the moment, some very good press and whatever international positive attention that comes to Poland. But beyond that, a time would come that it would start hurting Poland's demographics. And that is when the brass tacks would actually hit smaller countries with lesser populations, such as Poland and many other. That point is there. Another question that Murad, that you have picked up, and you were talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Please also do keep in mind that when we look at the 1962 October Cuban Missile Crisis, we tend to look at the crisis from a singular window, that the U-2 flights picked up missile silos being constructed, and some of them already constructed in Cuba, which was kind of a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, and the US did what it did, and the essence of decision and passive aggression and all that stuff that comes with it, and how Robert Kennedy's decision averted the Third World War from happening. But no one actually picks up the previous chapter and finds out as to why it happened. Because the US had lined up missiles 3 times the number of what Russia was doing, or Soviet Union actually at that time was doing in Cuba. So it is also a lot to do with the selective imagery and interpretation that the media and the Western literature has given us. And I think we will remain much wiser when we become more and more adept at having declassified documents at our disposal, and also looking at what type of alternate literature is available and what type of information that we can look at. Jamal's point about emerging technologies nullifying the edge nuclear weapons have, that is so true. And I would absolutely not like it to remain a monologue by me. I would truly appreciate, Faraz already has his hands up, so please, Faraz, help me out in this narrative when I stop blabbering. But the fact that conventional weapons do remain conventional, and the threshold that one crosses into the nuclear weaponry is a totally different realm altogether. And there is no substitute to that. Once you cross into the nuclear threshold, then there is no turning back. And absolutely, you are very right in pointing out that the emerging technologies, short of WMDs, has a lot of edge to nullify the higher edge countries have in terms of maintaining their nuclear weapons. Because to date, the experimentation that is happening under the nuclear shadow or under the nuclear hang is an adventure, or it is a mischief that countries can afford. And there have been several treaties and conventions to make conventional weapons not so lethal that you then don't desire nuclear weapons. And also, we need to keep in mind that there are several countries, there are a handful of countries that have nuclear weapons, and then there are double digits who are aspirant nuclear weapon states. But then there's many, many countries in the world which are not nuclear. They don't have an incentive to nuclearize. So this debate will always remain there. Last but not least, Sikandar's point about the buffers and the neutrality of the buffer. Unless and until there is a doctrine that says that the buffer will remain neutral and a no war zone, Afghanistan was a buffer, Burma/Myanmar was a buffer, and we can see what is happening there. So this becomes questionable, and you will always, countries, when they have their vested interest, they will always have one way or another in circumventing international conventions and disregarding them, finding out, fishing up a genuine reason or not so genuine reason. We had the American equivalent of contemporary crusades under George Bush Jr., which totally turned the wave of international discourse in a different direction post 9/11. So justifying your entry into a war is not at all a very difficult thing. And overriding international conventions of neutrality or anything is also not so difficult when you have your mind set on doing what you need to do. Faraz, over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. And I mean, you made some very good, you gave us a very good response to the points that were raised. I want to go in reverse order. So starting with like what I think Mr. Jamal said about how nuclear weapons may not be as relevant because of emerging technologies. And I think Shayan might be able to help add on to this afterwards, because like emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, all this stuff, it's not it's not a weapon by itself. It gets incorporated into any weapon system that you want, inclusive of nuclear weapons. So whether it's the warhead, the missile launcher, the security system, or the command and control system, if a country has the capability of a certain emerging technology, let's say artificial intelligence, it can incorporate that into its command and control system, reconnaissance system, its missile launchers, its warheads, everything. So it will make the existing arsenal even better. So if state A is able to fit AI-based navigation in its high precision weapons, which has a nuclear warhead, that nuclear weapon has become even more efficient, more destructive, more penetrative, as opposed to a missile that doesn't have that nuclear warhead. So emerging technologies, they're not a weapon on their own. So improvements in that will also improve the efficacy and the sort of destructive power of a nuclear weapon. So I don't think that the nuclear weapons will go out of fashion unless you invent some kind of electronic beam that can wipe out all communication, that sort of stuff that you do see in movies. Yes, if someone gets that, yes, that will overpower a nuclear weapon. But until that point comes, I don't see how that would happen. And then, so now going to the refugee thing, I feel that I get a bit more cynical because I end up looking at it from the economics perspective, and a refugee influx or even an immigration influx is never a good thing. You can't ever benefit from it, other than what Dr. Salma, you mentioned, that it's good press. It's good image building that you're taking on these people and you're helping them. But after a few months, it's simply a drain on the economy. And unless you're able to somehow naturalize all those refugees and get them into the workforce and actually create those additional jobs, which most countries don't have. Every country has a certain unemployment rate. So unless you can do that, any influx of refugees or even an influx of immigration will become a drain on any country's, the economy, and then over a point, due to economic dissatisfaction, when the population gets dissatisfied, it becomes a social issue as well. And we've seen that in many countries. And then,
absolutely, so true.
And then I think I'm forgetting who, but right at the beginning, Alina, she mentioned that how does the war come to an end? And I think that relates with what Sikandar said about the importance of geography and history. War, I mean, yes, it's easy to start, but in order to end it, it's so political. It's the political angle that can get it to stop, and that factors in the geography and the history. So unless either party or all the states involved get something out of it, or at least they can spin it in a way that they can sell to their population that, yes, we got this. A conflict that has started can never really end. It might simmer down, it might become less intense, but it will stay as a wound until Putin can tell its people that, you know what, we got Ukraine to do this, or America or Ukraine itself can say that we made Russia not bow down, but give in to these demands. Without it, because it becomes a political issue, and war itself is an instrument for a political objective, without that political resolution, you really can't see a conflict coming to an end. And that political resolution brings in the geographical factors and then the historical context of that conflict to begin with. And the Ukrainian historical context stretches back like before the Soviet Union became a thing, because they have historical interpretations. Russia has one, Ukraine has another. So it's a very complicated conflict. So I don't really think it will end. It'll just stay as a wound, similar to how Kashmir has stayed as just this festering thing that just doesn't seem to end. So yeah, that's from my side.
And hopping on to what Faraz's terminating point was about this remaining a festering wound, this is absolutely so right. When we are looking at conflict studies, what we tend to see is one thing that is taught to us in books is that one way to terminate a conflict is having some kind of a conflict resolution measure and sign a treaty, a war termination treaty, which ideally should have a perfect DDR, that is disarmament, demobilization, reconstruction, rehabilitation, and so many other things that are now attached to this, justice, governance, and all that. However, let's do a quick audit, if one has to do that, of any of the wars that have quote unquote terminated in the recent past. None of them have a perfect termination point. Even when the Americans deliberated wide and sharp on pulling out of Afghanistan, and President Barack Obama, as soon as he got voted into office, his first statement was that I'm going to pull out of Afghanistan and terminate that war and bring back our soldiers and all of that stuff. Really did not go down well. The Doha Accords are one of the faultiest things think of, and that is also after years of deliberation. And they have, as Faraz has also said, actually opened a new chapter of conflict in Afghan history. And that, again, given the geography and the history put together, shows that if you don't have a will to actually terminate the conflict, and that is all of the parties involved, and that's a near ideal situation, that all parties to the conflict would be on the same page. That never ever happens. Unless one of the party becomes so minimized and becomes so toothless that they don't have a say or a stake in the conflict left anymore, you will never have a perfect conflict resolution that is going to be a zero-sum game. 2 points that I would like to lay down with you people before I give the space to Dr. Imran. One aspect was about certain countries such as Sweden and others who have a very, very pronounced non-proliferationist stand and non-nuclear stance, taking up nuclear path as a result of what has happened in Ukraine. And this was a fear that many countries were facing as early as 2018. Conversation in CIPRI, there was a lot of deliberation upon what if the Russians become more aggressive than what they are. So how to tackle that? And another question is that, is it easy for, what type of leadership leads you into a war? One of the departing points that Bruno mentioned was Putin's dictatorship makes it easy for Putin to take up a decision. Now, bringing it to the South Asian scenario, do you think for ultra-nationalist, autocratic leaders, such as Narendra Modi as well, leading his country into a war, or actually they are on a war path, but actually leading them into a war is an action of false bravado, or they can actually take it up? I'll just hold my peace here. Over to Imran. Dr. Imran.
Thank you, Dr. Salma. I just want to make one comment, come question about the Ukraine and the Europe, and then come towards the South Asia. So first, if we look at the American security policy for Europe or Atlantic as a whole, was revolving around two factors in the past decade and so. The one was reviving the ballistic missile defense shield once they were out of the ABM, and the second one was the European GDP funds available for NATO operations or NATO requirements. That was 2% of the GDP that was demanded by the Americans. So whatever was the reason of the crisis, the experience for the Europeans would be either to again look back into the possibility of having an American-led ballistic missile defense shield in Europe, and then obviously to give money for the NATO, because NATO is providing them the security against any Russian provocations. So that would be a net positive to the American security perspective, whereas ideally it's not good for the Europeans, but they don't have probably other options, given that what if Mr. Putin starts another episode? The perception that Putin might be emboldened by the success in the Ukraine, and they would go probably against Sweden or other non-NATO countries. So that's one point, and I would like Dr. Salma you to respond on it. Now, coming towards the South Asian scenario, and we have two nuclear countries, and Mr. Jamal made a very good point of a use of emerging nuclear technologies to compensate the use of nuclear weapons. Now, I want to put a scenario in front of Mr. Jamal and to you as well. You know, the emerging technologies of conventional oriented technologies are meant for high precision targeting, and that actually supports the notion of a limited scale war where you can achieve your objectives in a very quick succession and then terminate the conflict and just give the impression that we are not interested in expanding the conflict. So these technologies, when proliferated within the South Asian scenario, that actually supports the Indian notion. And you talk about the Modi's perception of having a anti-Pakistan rant in the national politics. You know, the Indian military establishment will be obviously obsessive about the use of the sensitive technologies and then limiting the conflict and putting Pakistan into a very odd position to how to respond and, you know, try to maintain the escalation dominance at the same time and then ending the conflict. Now, the scenario is that Indian have had their cold start doctrine, whether they say it is there or not. But in such a case, the Pakistani response was to use the tactical nuclear weapons in our own territory, hypothetically speaking, or just simulating the thing. So in that case, Pakistan uses tactical nuclear weapon as a tester in its own area, just to give a nuclear signaling Indians to stop or whatever they are trying to achieve. And that is what is responded by the Indians at the same time by use of, say, cyber capabilities against the nuclear command and control of Pakistan. Now, that would render Pakistan into a problem of, temporarily becoming decapitated from the capability of using the nuclear weapons temporarily, because this is actually meant to target the command and control system, and that would put our strategic community into a problem that whether this intention was to delay a potential Pakistani response, or it would be like a precursor to a proper decapitating strike against the Pakistani assets. So that would turn Pakistani military community into a position to either think of using them or losing them. So the use of emerging nuclear technologies in a scenario where a crisis escalation can take a very unprecedented pace in the South Asian context would be actually complicating, instead of thinking that the use of emerging technologies will be compensating the use of nuclear weapons. So, I just want to put this in front of Mr. Jamal and to Dr. Sarmayu. Thank you.
Thank you. Adila?
Thank you. Yes, ma'am, I just want to put one more layer to the discussion. I agree with what Faraz and Murad is discussing about, that how it become more complex with the emerging technology, right? So, ma'am, the terminology I come across is about the cross-domain deterrence. So, when we talk about traditional domains and we have the phenomena that occurred and how the war has been terminated and had terminated in the past, right? So when we talk about these new emerging new domains, so it is also a new experience for states, as when Russia-Ukraine crisis unfolds, how in cyber domain and in space domain and how in hybrid domains, how war will going to be terminated, and what are the factors that are escalating them, and how and what will be the conditions that needs to terminate the war. I think that need more deliberation and discussions, and as we are very initial in our studying like that, so please ma'am, please give us your input on this aspect as well, that little bit deliberation for more discussion, that food for thought for us, that how these cross domains are making things more complex, and how we students can be more focused in a very refined way to study on it, and it will be very interesting and challenging as well. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Adila. Thank you. I can see your training coming from University of Lahore and under Rabia's very, very able wings, right? Okay, Faraz has already given me, thank you for helping me in ending this thing. Okay, right. Very quickly, whatever, and I think I'm actually not doing justice to the very strong questions that you people have asked or points that you people have raised. Number one, there's no substitute to the literature that we have around us. Literature, especially, and I'll be very quick about this because we're running short of time. Literature that we are receiving from the earlier time to now is a lot more richer, it's a lot more complicated, and it's a lot more accessible. So for a researcher today, the job is far more difficult because there are many sources through which you can gain knowledge. So gain knowledge and try and see what helps you, but don't try to just limit your information to one source of knowledge as such. Try to be as diverse as possible. Even countries such as, I mean, when we were growing up, there was only and only the Western literature which was predominant and available everywhere by and large. Very few amongst us would benefit from the Soviet literature. And that too was of the political nature rather than otherwise, literature or political nature, but not in the strategic discourse. Even China has now realized that it has to go in English, despite being one of the only countries in the world with the largest Chinese-speaking population groups. They do understand the notion of diversifying the information. So read, and read. That is the only thing that would come up. And reading is actually at the click of our hands, internet and so many other things. But having said that, how much do emerging technologies impact conflict? They do. They impact the quality of conflict. They impact the quality of performance of the belligerents. It simply does not simplify the conflict. It complicates the conflict a lot more. For countries such as Pakistan, although India hasn't made a 2-3 generational leap over Pakistan, but still it has the capacity to get type of technologies that Pakistan does not have. It has the purse to get technologies, but having said that, at the end of the day, India and Pakistan both need to realize that the type of doctrine that Pakistan has in terms of desperation, then Pakistan would do what it has to do. If it is outnumbered, if it is outsmarted, if you're using that scenario. And we have seen in this accident of BrahMos, which we would like to call an accident, how less of warning time that India and Pakistan enjoy between one another, something that was always mentioned in the books and in our writings, but now it has actually been proven. But the fact is that if it comes to that, if it comes to surgical strikes, if it comes to experimenting emerging technologies mixed with ultra-nationalist rhetoric, then of course countries such as Pakistan, even if we don't have that level of sophistication in technology which any other country would have, the response would be absolute and the response would be enormous, even at the cost of survival. So that becomes an aspect that no one is really going to negotiate upon or kind of deliberate upon. It's going to be an absolute response. But having said that, I would then come to your point, Adela, that when it comes to these emerging technologies, termination of conflict, ultimately it is the political scenario, it is the political leadership as to how best they negotiate or how well they would terminate the conflict. And that is the power of the political discourse. And that is also the power of the type of doctrines that we are entertaining with one another. And there has to be a clarity when it comes to even the internal deliberation on doctrines, even if you're not making them obvious. I'm sorry, with that, I would close the discussion for today. If anyone has any last point to raise, please do so before I hand over the mic to Faraz for any of his administrative or logistical announcements. And from me, thank you for bearing me for an extra 1 hour and for being such a wonderful audience. And I do see Mr. Humayun Khan from FES Pakistan. Thank you very much, Humayun, for providing us this forum along with Staff Asia, where we could all get together, deliberate, and we will be doing it in the coming 1 week, so to speak. Thank you. Faraz, the mic is yours. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salma. You really made, I mean, this discussion stayed as captivating as the initial lecture. So I was, not that I was surprised, I was just amazed that, I mean, we had all the participants staying, most of the participants, and they actively engaged in the discussion, which was great. So thank you to everyone who took part in the discussion. Just as the last, I'll stop the recording now.